Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
Hi, I wanted to talk briefly about what reason is. It's a word that's used a lot. One hears it an awful lot these days, but used to mean some very, very different things. And basically, reason had a very expansive definition in classical and medieval times. It got something like a very contracted meaning in the Enlightenment, which was sort of subsequently sharpened into a fine point, with almost no, width or depth in, sort of towards the end of the Enlightenment, getting into the modern, postmodern period, and essentially completely evaporating in the postmodern period to the point where it really means nothing at all. Now, I want to start backwards, though. So, when reason means nothing at all, and whatever. Shortly before reason came to mean nothing whatsoever, it meant what you might loosely call calculative reason, the sort of thing that you see done in mathematics. This is a thing which is entirely conscious, which is entirely discursive. It is translatable directly into words. And that's what I mean by discursive. It's a discourse. And that translatable into words is sort of one of the keys that you see people talk about this when they'll say that like something, was not a rational conclusion because somebody didn't think through the steps of an argument in words prior to coming to that conclusion, as if they, could number them all out and then have a, therefore, and then conclusion like I should spend some money to buy ice cream. And the decision-making process being, step 1, ice cream is nutritious. Step 2, ice cream does not have too many things like sugar that are bad for me, given the other things I've eaten right now. Premise 3 being I am in the mood for ice cream. And then, a number of steps about like what I'm in the mood for that won't hurt me, etc. And then finally, after all this argumentation has finished, therefore I should eat ice cream QED. Or I should buy ice cream QED. Nobody does that. Everyone knows that nobody does that. And yet, occasionally you will find people who think they're pointing something out by saying that nobody does that. This I find very, very strange. But this is, to some degree, what people will take reason to mean these days. Because it's some hybrid of, the recent several meanings to it. And I've seen this talking around on the internet. That people will say like, is this, does reason lead you to this conclusion, or reason on its own is not enough, or I only subscribe to reason. Now, nobody only subscribes to purely discursive reasoning. It's impossible to even get that bootstrapped if you did that. And so you'll see some things like people talk about, for example, people who realize that problem will then talk about how that reason depends upon faith. And mean by that to some degree, as I saw put recently, that you need to have premises in order to have an argument. You can't carry out the argument without premises, and the premises don't themselves come from the argument because you'd have an infinite recursion problem and never get started if you could never just have a premise. And that premise has to be, held true by faith. And this is not a false way of looking at things. That is entirely true of arguments. You need a premise, and you need a premise whose truth you take for granted, not whose truth you have argued to the conclusion of. However, this is one tiny little drop of what reason actually does, properly understood. And so I want to talk about, the majority of what reason actually is. Now, first off, this is going to be the classical and medieval definition of reason, although I'm not giving a formal definition. None of this is going to be formally rigorous. I'm giving this an informal sense. The idea being to keep it short enough that it could possibly be interesting, and to keep it intelligible, but enough that you can reconstruct it if you need to. Okay, so what is reason? Properly speaking, reason is so truth being the conformance of the mind to reality, first off. So, right away we're basically throwing out materialism as being irrelevant, because materialism, holds that there isn't a mind, there's just the epiphenomena of matter, etc. And it can't be conformed to anything, etc. It's all behavioral. Okay, so all that is thrown out. I'm not talking to you guys. You guys have nothing to talk about when it comes to this. Your conversation starts and ends with, it's all blind matter. Okay, so there are actual minds, those minds can conform to reality. Now, this is radically different from the idea of building a mental model which we then check. And reason comes in, though it is possible for reason to play in the imagination, and that, it can do that and build a model which might then look like something outside of the mind. But that's not the primary function of reason. The primary function of reason is rather to conform the mind to reality outside of the mind. But I believe it was St. Thomas who described it as the mind actually takes on the form of the thing contemplated. But reason, this is what reason, properly speaking, is doing. Reason is the apprehension of truth. Now, what is faith, together with reason? Well, I like to define, granted I'm the only one, so far as I know, but I like to define faith as reason extended through time. Because the thing about reason being something that something that conforms the mind to truth, is that if some true thing is not immediately in front of the mind to be apprehended, such as, for example, through the senses, or by way of the senses, let me phrase it slightly differently, then reason can't conform the mind to it because it's not there to be conformed to. The mind, our minds are finite and only in touch with some things, some real things, at any given time. How does the mind conform itself to things which are not present right now? Well, it has conformed, in order for it to do that, it has to have conformed itself to them in some fashion. And this conformance to the thing which is not immediately present is what we call faith. Now, faith, very colloquially, can be described as, knowing the truth of something for which you do not immediately have the evidence present. And that's probably more useful in a day-to-day fashion. So, to give a simple example of faith, take faith in a person. You know that somebody keeps their word. And then, say you're a parent, and you've got a teenage child who keeps their word, and you told them that they're to be back, from having fun with friends by 10:30 p.m. And you know that they keep their word. They promise that they will do this, and they keep their word. Which of the following actions is having faith in the person? Sitting there by the door with your watch, waiting carefully, or going about your business as if they are going to be back on time, and possibly, if you get up early in the morning, say, going to sleep at 10 o'clock at night, because they're going to keep their word and do the right thing. One of those is having faith. It's the one where you are acting as if the thing is true. So what are you doing? What does that faith consist of in that case? It is acting according to that which you know to be true, even though the evidence for the truth of that is not presently in front of you. You don't have evidence immediately while your teenager is not even in your house that your teenager is going to come through the door by 10:30 because they promised to do that. Obviously barring things like, cars breaking down and buses breaking down, etc. But, all things like, of this nature have the caveats of not everything is within a person's control. But all those things which are, that a person will exercise their control in order to do that. But you don't have evidence of that in front of your face. It's all entirely outside the house in which you are currently sitting. So sitting there, as if it's not going to happen, is acting as if there isn't the evidence, or, tracking somebody on a map, on a GPS, tracking their phone on a map these days becomes possible, and so on. Those are not actions of faith in the person, because those are seeking evidence for the thing. It's trying to bring the evidence in front of you, rather than being content that you know it, even though the evidence is not presently in front of you. Now, this is the thing, because people will talk about faith as if there is some sort of, or two meanings to the word faith, one secular and one religious, but there isn't. The word faith means exactly the same thing in both contexts. There is, now, something else that should be pointed out is that people work out the truth of things from all sorts of different directions. And so, and here again, we come to that, that odd prejudice, as if, the only valid way to conclude anything is starting from a properly basic belief, and then, working deductively through discursive reason over to some conclusion. That's not how people actually work, but the mere fact that you aren't starting from a properly basic belief, and you can see this, like in Descartes. right? In Meditations on First Philosophy. Let me doubt everything. Is there anything that I can't not doubt? Well, clearly I exist. Because, somebody is saying this, and then, somebody's saying the I exist. So the idea that you need to start from something like that, something which nobody can doubt, has nothing to do with how human beings actually work, because we're in a world. We know lots of things merely by virtue of being in a world. And so reason, faith in that way is not, just the premises of something discursive, but really, properly speaking, the way faith is normally used is that knowledge of things not currently present. Now, there's a video, and I'm not sure what order I'm going to put it up, that either I've made or will have up soon, in which I talk about how God is the central fact of all things being composite entities are a rational ordering of things towards the good. And since all things are this, all things point to God, and therefore faith in God, what people will say, religious faith, is, again, here it is, if you contemplate these things, you will see how they point to God. If you are not currently contemplating them, you don't see how they point to God, but you can remember that they pointed to God. And this remembrance of them pointing to God, that you are presently doing, presently not doing. You're not presently not doing that contemplation, but you remember having done that contemplation. You carry with you, remember to put together. You carry with you that knowledge of what you came to know from before. This again is carrying that reason that you were doing, the apprehension of God, by through creation. You are carrying that through time into the present, even though you are not currently contemplating it. So that faith is again exactly the same thing. It is carrying the knowledge gained through reason over time. Now, we are creatures in time. If we didn't carry that with us, there's an interesting character. I think it was in a Douglas Adams thing. It was called like The Wisest Man in the Universe or something like that. And then they went and found him, and I forget exactly. It was like on his own planet or something like that. I forget. It's been 25 years since I read this story, so I'm sure I'm getting a lot of the details wrong, and my apologies to Douglas Adams fans. But the thing that really stuck out about him is that he was the man who doubted everything. He was kind of like a perfect Humean skeptic when you get to it, because Hume held that there's no such thing as causality, or at least we have no reason to believe there is such thing as causality. All we have is anticipated sense experience, but we have no reason to believe that our anticipation of the sense experience actually means something about the outside world. That's Humean skepticism. If you're going to be a Humean skeptic, by the way, kiss goodbye to science, because it utterly destroys it. Everything is engineering, which you actually find a lot of people doing these days. They don't actually care about science, though they'll use the word, but what they only care about is engineering, which is placing bets on things that will work out. Anyway, based on past experience. Anyhow, point being, so he would do, he never believed that anything he knew in the past really, predicted anything in the future. And so every time he took a pencil and scraped it on a piece of paper, he was surprised that it left a mark. And I think he even carried it forward to the point of, after he did that, he was surprised that it left a mark, but then he didn't even believe that it had left a mark, because, how do you know in the present that that's what happened? How do you know that your memory is in fact true? And so that's, if you don't carry knowledge with you through time, if you don't extend reason over time, that's where you're left. You're left in this incredibly animalistic, many animals even remember the past. Exactly in what way we don't know, but, because they can't tell us. But in any event, you're left with this incredibly simplistic sort of model of, here's stuff, and in the moment you react to it, and that's it. That's the sum total if you're not going to carry reason across time. The moment is very, very, very thin. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, had a really neat thing. It was in book 11? Oh, I really hope that's correct. Of the Confessions. Chapter 11 of book 2? That sounds slightly more correct. I forget, anyway. So it's towards the end. He's asking, what is time? If I don't think about it, then I certainly know what it is. But if I think about it, I have no idea what it is. And it's a very strange thing, because there's the future, which we can't touch, and the past, which we remember but can't get at. And the only part of time we actually can do anything with is the present, but the present is in every moment rushing into the past. So the future, which we can't see, becomes the present in which we can do something, but as soon as it becomes the present, it becomes the past. The present is this incredibly fine slice of who knows what. We don't understand how time works. How does one moment become the next moment? None of us has any clue. And so if you're not going to carry reason across time, that's to say, if you're not going to have faith, you're left with something that fits in the tiniest razor-thin slice of who knows what. That's why faith is integral to reason. That's why faith is inseparable to reason. That's why it means nothing whatsoever to talk about a war between faith and reason. There is no war between faith and reason. There cannot be a war between faith and reason. Because faith is the carrying through, is reason across time. Now, this is already stretching long, so I'm going to cut it short here. I don't mean to say that it's impossible for a person to be mistaken. It is possible, therefore, for a person to be mistaken either in their present reason or in their past reason. And if they're carrying a mistake across time, then obviously that will conflict with something in the present. Or if they're making a mistake now, that will conflict with something true that was carried across. There can be a conflict in that extremely limited sense that it is possible for reason to be mistaken, and therefore carrying it across time can be carrying an error across time or contradicting an error presently made. Other than that, there is no war between the two of them. And the strange idea that faith has something to do with believing in things without evidence is, it's a massive misunderstanding of what evidence is, and it's a massive misunderstanding of what belief is, but basically it consists of taking reason in its fullness and contracting it down to that tiny little portion of it which is discursive. But this just means the only people who can do this are people who have never thought about it. Because if you think about it for even a moment, we don't live our lives discursively. Our thinking is done almost entirely in a non-discursive way. So why people do this, that itself is the subject of many, many videos. Anyway, suffice it to say, it's a terrible idea to mistake the fullness of reason for one tiny little discursive sliver because of a bunch of mistakes people made 300 years ago. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.